This is the Unshaw Podcast, the podcast about atheism, religion, and everything in between.
Good morning and welcome back to the Unshaw Podcast. On my return from the lovely Balkan state of Montenegro and to a much cooler UK, where the national conversation seems endlessly fixated on migrants crossing the channel, I thought it best to ground myself again with a dose of reason. And who better for that than the voice of reason himself and general all-round good egg, Stuart Sorensen. In today's episode, Stuart and I are going to dive into a fascinating and often misunderstood subject, the intersection of religion and mental health. The last time he was on, Stuart challenged the idea that religion itself is a form of madness. This time we go further, from religious OCD to the so-called Jerusalem syndrome, from guilt and trauma in high control groups to the cultural weight of religious delusions. We'll unpack how faith and psychology overlap, hopefully without falling into easy stereotypes. So whether you're a believer, a skeptic, or just curious about why humans think the way we do, this is certain to be a conversation that promises both insight and the occasional eyebrow-raising story. Good morning, Stuart. Thanks for joining me again this morning.
Thank you for having me.
So, we last spoke over 12 months ago now when you told me your story. And we touched on the idea that you debunked about being religious being a form of madness, I guess, or religion itself being a mental health condition, which you disagreed with and gave me the rationale. I remember saying to you after that presumably you've seen religion fostering or causing mental health problems in people. And it was something that I didn't pursue at the time, and I think it's an issue that is worth exploring.
Okay.
So I first wanted to talk about mental health disorders which are inherently to do with religion, and then we can talk about the perhaps more generic mental health conditions that religious life can cause. And obviously we need to be mindful of patient confidentiality. Will not reveal too much about any particular individual. The mental health disorders that are inherently to do with religion, and I've done a little bit of research prior to the show this morning. The first one is to talk about what is termed religious OCD.
Okay.
I guess with OCD, we've got the obsession bit, the idea that one is a bad person, one is going to go to hell, where one is scared of offending God. That's the obsession part of it. And the compulsions can include excessive confession or repeatedly praying. Someone with this form of obsessive compulsive disorder is driven by intense anxiety and distress, and their compulsions often interfere with their daily life. Is that something that you have any experience of?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, of course. Yeah, I've met people with all forms of OCD. I've been doing this a long time, including people who have religious forms of OCD. But the religion is not the thing that causes the OCD. It's simply where that person puts their OCD. OCD, is, you're quite right, it's an anxiety state. And it's based upon a principle we call magical thinking, which is the idea that if you can perform a particular ritual act, you can prevent some unconnected bad thing from happening. I knew a young lady once who used to have a ritual way of walking up and down the stairs, based around the number 4. And she believed that that would prevent natural disasters. Now, obviously, that's magical thinking. She got that because of a particular incident when she was much younger involving the number 4. So she latched onto number 4, and that became the focus of her OCD, because the event was important to her. If you develop an OCD and you have a strong religious belief, then in exactly the same way, you may latch onto the religious belief as part of your OCD, but the OCD was there first. The religion did not cause it. It's simply where you put it. So whereas this young lady's ritual involved going up and down the stairs 4 steps at a time, another person who's very religious might find that the symptom of their OCD, where they put their anxiety and their magical thinking, involves their religion. But it's not a causation.
Yeah. I mean, I've heard OCD latches onto things which are important to us.
Indeed.
In the same way that the very stereotypical idea of OCD is obsessive tidiness and cleanliness, and that stems from a fear of contamination or something similar. And in this religious OCD, then the OCD, I guess, latches onto the religion. So another one to talk about is religious trauma syndrome. And this is describing a set of symptoms which are experienced by someone who's been exposed to a quite toxic or high control religious organization.
To be honest, the term religious trauma syndrome isn't one I'm familiar with. It may be an Americanization. So I'm not familiar with that term.
Sorry, just looking at my notes here, it does say that religious trauma syndrome is similar to complex post-traumatic stress disorder.
That's where I was going.
Yeah.
CPTSD.
Yeah, so I guess it's when someone extracts themselves from a high-control religion and the associated mental health problems that may cause.
Possibly.
Have you encountered people like, I don't know, Scientologists or perhaps Jehovah's Witnesses who leave their movements and as a result develop mental health problems as they take themselves away from that context?
I'm going to have to take issue with the way you describe that as they develop mental health problems as a result of that contact. Because whilst technically you're right, it's not reasonable to bias ourselves to look only at the religious contact. You can get those sorts of problems from any group. However, the group is not the religious belief. And the belief itself, which is where we started this, the belief is not a mental disorder, but interactions of groups can be toxic. From a religious group to a family group to a group of friends at school or college or work, any group has the potential to be toxic, but not because it's religious. And yeah, CPTSD is often related to interactions with a toxic or controlling group.
So, for example, the symptoms might be similar to someone coming out of an abusive relationship.
Absolutely. And that's often where the label of CPTSD gets applied. The greatest use of that is either an abusive relationship or, more commonly in my experience as a mental health clinician, an abusive childhood. That's not necessarily religious.
So I guess religious trauma syndrome, in your eyes, would be post-traumatic stress disorder caused by exposure to a religious group, actually.
I think so. But as I say, it's a term I'm not familiar with. I don't think it's in ICD, which is a diagnostic manual most of the world uses. I'm not familiar with it, but yeah, that sounds plausible to me.
Just 2 more to talk about, and then we'll talk about more generic mental health conditions. Religious delusions. So, I guess we're talking here about people who believe that they are Jesus, or they believe they're the Messiah, or they believe they're a prophet. People who believe that they are possessed by demons. People who believe they have committed unforgivable sins, even when that has no basis in reality. I mean, how common are these?
Oh, very common. But no more common, for example, than the belief that they're being contacted by aliens. I remember many years ago nursing a bloke who was convinced, this was in the 1990s, he was convinced he was in contact by radio with the crew of a World War II Lancaster bomber. These sorts of things, they're just features of psychotic disorders. And again, people latch on to what's culturally significant. It's really interesting that throughout medieval history, people regularly were attacked by demons or visited by angels who spoke to them. We then started changing that. As people moved away from that religious perspective, it became less common. And then in the 70s, we got Close Encounters of the Third Kind, and suddenly people get visited by aliens and the angels have dropped off. People will interpret their experiences, their hallucinations, for example, in ways that appear culturally significant to them. But again, these people are psychotic first, and then they make sense of it later.
Okay, and just one more to talk about. This one really interests me. Jerusalem syndrome.
Yeah.
So, for the benefit of listeners, it's not listed as an official diagnosis in the DSM or the ICD, and is not specific to one religion, and it's been reported to affect people from Jewish, Christian, and Muslim backgrounds. And I'm just going to talk about the symptoms of it. So it's people who visit Jerusalem and experience religious-themed ideas or experiences. And just to give you a couple of examples of what people with this syndrome are said to experience. So when they're on a group tour in Jerusalem, for example, they have an overwhelming desire to tour Jerusalem by themselves and leave the group with whom they are visiting. They can wear white robes is another reported symptom of Jerusalem syndrome. Vocal outbursts involving loudly singing hymns, psalms or verses from the Bible. And I mean, I'm not sure whether this sounds like it's all made up, but it says the final stage is giving a sermon in a holy place, which is often disorganized and irrational. And apparently the disorder is said to wear off some weeks after they leave Jerusalem. So what do you think about all that then?
Well, I think it's interesting you said you don't know whether it was made up. I don't think it is. I think these are likely to be real experiences. But the reporting is, as far as I'm aware, anecdotal. I'm not aware of any research on Jerusalem syndrome. That doesn't mean there isn't any, but I don't know of it if there is. And I think that there are various possibilities to explain what's going on here. First of all, I don't believe there is a set pattern that ends with people giving an incoherent sermon. Some people may do that. I would not assume that that's the majority by any means. But you talked about people going on a trip to the Holy Land. So these are people who are probably going on the sort of trip that my sister used to lead, where they'd get on a coach, perhaps from UK or wherever else, they'd cross the channel and then they'd travel all through Europe on this bus, and they're together for days on this coach with very little to do except talk in the presence of their clergy. And my sister, who's a retired vicar, will tell you that people tend not to let their hair down very much when she's on the bus. So they're going to end up talking about religious stuff because that's safe. So you've had 3 days of travelling on a bus through Europe, talking about religion. You're not going to be particularly well rested. And then you arrive at this place which is geared up to give you this overwhelming emotional experience. Some of those people are going to fall foul of that. That does not mean that the religion itself has caused it, which again is where we started with this. It's to do with the perfect storm, a conspiracy of circumstance, part of which is actually designed to hit your psychology hard, because that's how the Holy Land is set up now in this modern age of tourism. So I think some of those people are just going to be overwhelmed by the circumstances in which they find themselves. But there will be other people who basically thought they were the Messiah or whatever before they even thought about visiting Jerusalem. Now you think about it. If you're a Christian who thinks it's the Messiah, or a Jew who thinks it is the return of Moses, or you are a Muslim who thinks that you have some sort of message from Allah, where are you going to go? It seems reasonable to me that if you have that psychotic experience, it would make sense that you want to go to Jerusalem. First of all, I think it's anecdotal, but I think these are real experiences. I have no idea about the actual numbers, but off the top of my head, almost, I can think of 2 decent explanations for what might be going on. And I'm sure if you and I were to sit down in a room and think exclusively about that for an hour or two, we'd come up with dozens of plausible explanations that do not involve religion being a mental disorder, because it just isn't.
So these are manifestations of more generic mental health conditions. It's just that when they have a religious theme, there seems to be this terminology, which has arisen.
Yeah, and it's partly because of people like you and I, atheists. Because many atheists will just assume, without a modicum of understanding, that religion is a mental disorder. It's not. It's irrational, but we're all irrational. We evolved to be irrational as a species. You cannot say that religion is a mental disorder simply because it's a manifestation of the sort of cognitive biases that we all exhibit.
So, with regards to religion and mental health illness, what is the most common mental health condition that you have experienced with people who are actively religious?
I'm not entirely sure, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One is because I don't really discuss people's religious views at work. It would be really unethical of me to do that unless they bring it up.
But I'm talking about more where the mental health condition has a religious theme. So it must be that is brought up in your conversation.
Okay, well, in those contexts, probably guilt, which is a feature of depression. We get a symptom of depression known as pathological guilt, which you touched on earlier when you said people feel guilty about things that clearly weren't their fault or that they hadn't done. Because one thing that religions are very good at, particularly Catholicism, I think, that's certainly the stereotype, but also the sort of fundamentalist evangelical churches I used to be involved in, they're very good at throwing guilt. One of the principles that I teach people is to neither throw guilt nor catch it. You can regret, but you don't have to consider that your wrong action globally defines you. But yeah, I would think probably guilt. But again, people have pathological guilt for all sorts of reasons, not just religious ones.
And I remember talking about a year ago to an ex-Jehovah's Witness who mentioned not necessarily mental health problems, but perhaps it's more of an issue with readapting. But she mentioned people who leave a religion, and perhaps this is going back to the kind of post-traumatic stress disorder thing, but it's got to be quite disorientating, isn't it, for somebody who has lived a life under a certain set of beliefs and have undergone many years of taking part in religious practices, and they come to the realization that ultimately they've lived their life under a lie. And that's got to be quite mentally crushing for someone, hasn't it?
Absolutely. And in my own experience, as I told you last time, I was 10 years as a Christian, and by the end of that, a very, very devout fundamentalist young earth creationist. And it took me about 2 years to get out of that and to restructure my perception of the world. Now, you could say that religion caused that, but I would argue that the religious groups I belonged to were toxic. You could make the same argument for, if you look on YouTube now, we're talking in August 2025, if you look on YouTube at MAGA voters in America who are rethinking their entire worldview as a result of the big beautiful bill, for example, and how they've lost their Medicare, or they've lost their jobs, or both, or they have to give up their job to look after their elderly parents because they've been kicked out of the nursing home because the Medicare isn't being paid. They're rethinking their worldview and they're having a similar trauma. So I think what we're talking about here is trauma when the world you used to rely on suddenly becomes obviously unreliable. But again, that's generic trauma response. It's not in itself religious, unless you want to say that being an American Republican is a mental illness. And I don't think anybody would take that seriously.
I could think of people who would take it seriously, but...
Well, yeah, but come on.
Let's get on to treatment. And you talked about guilt, for example. What would be your approach to somebody who came to you, for example, and said, oh, I feel I'm a bad person because I can't live up to God's standards. God's going to punish me. I'm a bad person. My religion says don't do this and I do it. And I'm going to go to hell. I'm not worthy. How do you approach treating somebody who would come with that set of symptoms?
First of all, that's not a set of symptoms. That's an opinion. If there are no symptoms of, say, for example, anxiety or depression, then it wouldn't be for me to treat anyway. It's just somebody who has a concern, and I would suggest that they speak to their pastor or priest.
But what if that person, it was genuinely making them ill?
Well, then we would treat that. The first line would be biological. I would talk to them. I don't necessarily come out from behind my cover as somebody who is very, very interested and quite knowledgeable about certainly Christianity. I know my Bible better than most Christians. I've read it several times. I usually say something like, well, I don't really understand about Christianity. I don't know much about it.
Okay.
Which is technically true because I'm not an expert. I'm not bad Elvin, So I will say that I don't really understand. I'm not the person to talk to. But what I can do is talk to you about the symptoms of your depression, and we can find ways to deal with that. And I would also like to get you an appointment to talk to our psychiatrist about antidepressants. In terms of the religious stuff, I'll go right back to where I was, which is that I would advise you to talk to somebody who can give you a balanced understanding of your faith, and I'm not the person to do that. Because I'm not. As an atheist, I can't give them any advice about that. Whether I wanted to or not, I would be working towards undermining their faith, and I have no right to do that. Who cares what I think? They didn't come here for me to change their religion. They came here because they feel bad. So I would still probably send them to their pastor or priest, unless I knew that it was a particularly toxic group. Well, there have been a couple of cases over my career where that's happened, and I've sent them to local groups, because there's always a local group on the internet, where people will help them to talk through, in an unbiased manner, their religious problems. But as a mental health nurse, it would be entirely unethical for me to get into that, particularly as an atheist trying to talk to somebody of faith about the tenets of their religious belief. It would just be unreasonable.
Would it not be an ethical course of action, and a course of action which would be quite effective, to say to these people, between you and me, there is no hell. There's no God up there judging you about the things that you are doing. Hell isn't real. It must be a temptation to perhaps consider that as a course of action.
Of course it's a temptation, but it's not something that I would do. It wouldn't be ethical to do that. That would only be ethical if nobody had ever said to them, there is no God, there is no hell. They'll have heard that loads of times. It's like for donkey's years I was a smoker. Just about every day somebody told me it was bad for them. And by the end of that time, my reaction was always, is it really? I didn't know that. Are you sure? Smoking's bad for me. Well, thank you so much for telling me. Because it's not going to do anything except create a barrier in our therapeutic relationship. I can't prove there is no God. I can't prove there's no hell. I don't believe it. So what? And another of the mantras that good mental health nurses have to keep in their heads is, who cares what I think? It's not my place to attack their worldview. They came here for help with a mental disorder, and I will do what is within my professional ability to deal with that, but I'm not going to attack their faith.
But what if that faith, and we've talked about high control religious organisations, what if that faith represents a safeguarding?
Well, that's a different issue. Then I have a professional responsibility to, as we say in the trade, to raise a safeguarding, which basically means that it's properly investigated by people who have the authority to do it, such as a local authority working in tandem with the police. If somebody is being psychologically abused or sexually abused or physically or whatever, if their human rights are being breached in any way, then I have a duty to raise a safeguarding. But that's not normally what we're talking about. We're talking about sincere believers talking about what they sincerely believe, and I come back to who cares what I think. It's not my place to attack someone's worldview. It's certainly not my place to assume that it's mental disorder.
So your stance has been that religion doesn't cause these issues. The issue is there in the first place, and the religion is the theme of that mental health disorder. And you talked about all human beings being irrational, whether religious or not. What do you mean by we're all irrational?
Okay, well, first of all, I want to separate irrational from mental disorder, because they're not the same thing. A mental disorder, by definition, has to be something outside of the norm. And if irrational is normal, then mental disorder is something else. Most professionals in mental health services would say is that it has to be a mental health issue which makes it difficult for people to function within their society. If you look at the changing definitions of mental disorder, you'll see how, as societal values change, the definitions of mental disorder change. It's only a few decades ago that being gay, or as they would have said then, homosexuality, was a mental disorder. But then as society decided that being gay doesn't stop you functioning in society, then it no longer was a mental disorder because it's about function or distress. They're the problems. They're the issues. But yeah, we're all irrational because we evolved that way, and we have what you call heuristics or mental shortcuts that we all use. So, for example, there are three I want to talk about. The first one is pattern seeking. We are all pattern seekers. That's why when you look at the clouds, you might see faces, or you might even see Jesus, if you're of a particular religious bent. That's a thing called pareidolia, and it's where we see images that aren't there. So that's the first one. Keep that in mind. The second one is we are agency detectors. And again, we evolved to identify agency, to assume that there is an individual or a being or a group causing what happens. So we see a pattern, which may or may not be there because we don't see everything, but we detect a pattern and we ascribe agency to it. We say someone has caused that. And then the one that ties them all together, and I'll give you some illustrations about where you see this in a minute, is the idea of type 1 and type 2 errors, which is again an evolved heuristic. So if you imagine that you are a primitive man on the African plains, and you are stood just at the edge of a large savanna next to the jungle, and there is some undergrowth just behind you and you hear a noise. Now that might be a saber-toothed cat about to eat you, or it might not. If you make a type 1 decision, you will decide that it is a saber-toothed cat and you will run away. And whether you're right or not, whether that's correct or what we call a type 1 error, you live. If you make a type 2 error, if you decide it isn't a saber-toothed cat and it is, I'm afraid you're out of the gene pool. So over time, the people who made type 1 decisions, even if they're an error, tended to survive longer and breed more. So the evolutionary principle is that we tend to make type 1 errors. We believe the positive thing as opposed to the negative. So we believe it's really happening rather than it's not. Put those together. You see a pattern that may or may not exist. You believe that someone or something is behind it, and you decide that must be true. They're your three main heuristics that I want to talk about. And now think about every conspiracy theory you've ever heard of, and you find those things. Then think about people getting disgruntled when things go wrong at work and they decide that their boss did it on purpose, which is really common, because we're all guilty of these things. That's why the scientific method has come up with things like randomized controlled studies and double-blind studies. It's to try and combat these evolved traits that make us irrational. Now, I would argue that religions are evidence of those same traits. They've seen a pattern that isn't really there. They've decided on an agency, which is called God or whatever, and then they decide it must be true. They make a type 1 error. Well, that's no different from people deciding that the Twin Towers was an inside job. These are perfectly sane but not healthy human evolved traits. Religion is not a mental disorder, any more than all of our other silly ideas are.
So going back to the whole religion as a mental health disorder, which is something that you clearly disagree with, it's more that religion is a manifestation of these generic features that all human beings have.
Yeah.
And so with regards to the agency detection, for example, we all think when things go wrong that people are conspiring against us when that's not necessarily the case. Type 1 errors, we hear a branch falling off a tree in the middle of a forest and we think it's a predator or a monster trying to get us.
We're very, very good at assuming threat where threat does not exist.
Yeah.
And you can see why we evolved to do that. I mean, there are other heuristics that come into play. Like another one that's really, really common is what we call the availability heuristic. The last evidence you have of something is the thing that sticks in your mind. Now, if you think about being a primitive nomadic part of a very small tribe, and suddenly there's no water, you will remember where you last saw water, because there's a very good chance there'll still be water there. So you've got the availability heuristic, so you remember the last thing you saw. And if the last thing that seems relevant is that the boss looked at you funny that day when you left work 5 minutes early, and then you find that there's a problem with your wages, well, it's not difficult to see how all of that fits together. But this is just part of the human condition. In order for it to be a mental disorder, it needs to be something apart from the human condition. Religion is just more of the same.
So I want to talk about your opinions about how mental health should be treated, because I know there are lots of naysayers who will say that, sadly, and perhaps this might be an issue of resources more than anything else, is that we're too reliant on drugs, on medication to solve mental health conditions. And some people say, oh, well, it's just a sticking plaster. It's just an expedient way of making people feel a bit better. There are many people who think that's the wrong way to deal with mental health conditions, and it's more cognitive behavioral therapy and so on, which is more effective, but presumably more expensive because you're having to pay people to conduct that sort of treatment. Do you think that in this country and perhaps in other places as well, we've gone too far down the line of just putting people on medication?
Yes and no. I think it depends upon the condition. For example, if we're talking about an anxiety state, I have absolutely no problem with giving people anxiolytic medication briefly, because that will allow them to relax enough to do the cognitive work that people like me will do with them. If it turns into a long-term medication regime, then I think all that we're actually doing is fostering dependence. So in that sense, I would agree. And I would make a similar argument in respect of depression. When you're looking at psychosis, then I think we have a very different situation.
Yeah.
Now there are, and in fact my postgraduate diploma is about how to do this in practice, there are cognitive behavioral therapy techniques specifically designed for working with people with long-term psychotic disorders like schizophrenia, for example. But they don't work for everyone. And in the meantime, we need to do something. See, people will often slag off antipsychotic medication on the grounds that certainly the first ones, and the first one was chlorpromazine, you might know it as Largactil. That came out in the 1950s. It's an incredibly dirty drug in terms of side effects. And it was a few decades before we realized that the first generation of antipsychotics created irreversible physical side effects that are really intolerable and shortened life by a couple of decades. We didn't know that at the time. We do now, which is why those drugs are rarely used. We went from those, which are the typicals, to the atypicals, and now we're on the next generation, and actually probably the next generation after that. But I would argue that even chlorpromazine, with all of its problems, was better than nothing, because prior to that, we had lifelong incarceration.
Yeah.
Now, which would you prefer?
Indeed.
Because people will often slag off antipsychotics because there are side effects. Well, frankly, so is aspirin. That's got side effects too. But they don't think about having side effects versus lifelong incarceration. They think about having side effects versus not having side effects. Well, yeah, that would be better, but that's not the reality.
And presumably it's going to be very difficult to try to impress on someone who's psychotic or has schizophrenia, to try and solve that by trying to convince them that their delusions are not true. That's going to be quite a fool's errand, isn't it?
That's not what we do. I am not.
Well, I presumed it wasn't, because that's not going to happen. You're not going to talk someone out of schizophrenia, or someone who's psychotic are not going to be amenable to someone saying to them, oh, come on, you're not Napoleon.
Interestingly, what we now call schizophrenia was first identified by a guy called Eugen Bleuler. And Bleuler called it dementia praecox, or the dementia of the young. And he described it as a self-limiting condition. Basically, people recovered. And if you look at the international study of schizophrenia, in many third world countries, there's a much higher recovery rate than we have now in this country. Probably because we rely upon so much medication, which also tranquilizes people to the point that they can't think it through. I was talking about my postgrad. Part of that stuff was about working with people to increase their coping. And as we increase their coping and understanding, we gradually take down the meds. Because if you don't take down the meds, they're not going to complete the job. So that's a valid argument, and I would agree with that absolutely. However, what happened, effectively, there were two camps. There was Eugen Bleuler's camp about dementia praecox being self-limiting. And then there was a guy called Emil Kraepelin. And Emil Kraepelin won the argument by saying that it is impossible to reason somebody out of a psychosis. But from what little I know, I don't think anybody really knows what his techniques were, other than he probably did something like you just described, where they say, oh yes, the moon's made of green cheese. And he says, no, it isn't. I'm telling you it's not, and I'm the doctor. I don't care, the moon's still made of green cheese. Oh, it's impossible to convince you of anything. We don't do that now. The mainstay of the work that we do in these situations is not to tell anybody what we think, but we use Socratic dialogue to ask them to think it through and explain it. And without saying so, we use techniques very much akin to Occam's razor, that if this is true, this must also be true. So if, for example, the moon is made of green cheese, well, where does the cheese come from? Well, cheese comes from milk, it comes from cows. Okay, what do cows eat? What do they breathe? Well, they eat grass, they breathe oxygen. Is there oxygen on the moon? And we don't tell them what we think, we ask them extensional questions. Sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. But I think it would be very silly to assume that we can just get rid of antipsychotics on the grounds that we can use a therapeutic technique that, to be honest, is still in its infancy.
What's your take on the various studies that suggest that there is a positive correlation between being religious and being happy?
Again, I think it's the same problem. Just as I think that it's superficial misunderstanding to say that religion is mental illness, I also think it's a superficial misunderstanding to equate happiness with being religious. Religious people tend to live lives where they are part of supportive groups. And that's the thing that makes you happy. It's being supported and being cared for. We are a social species. And if you particularly look at the modern world, and if you look at certainly the urban modern world, an awful lot of people live very isolated lives. We know that causes depression. There's lots of studies to talk about that. Being part of a congregation that meets once or twice a week and everybody smiles and hugs each other when they do the piece and all of that, that's lovely. Part of my life has been I'm very into performing arts. Being part of a close-knit theatre group is just as good.
Yeah. And you could say that potentially a positive correlation between being happy and being a supporter of a football team, for example. And, many people have made comparisons between supporting a football team and religion. There's congregation, there's communal singing, there's the hugging of strangers, there's the sense of community, there's a connection that you have with people that you don't necessarily know.
Indeed. There's also a sense of purpose very often, particularly in evangelical groups. There's a guy called Albert Ellis, who's the founder of rational emotive therapy in the 1940s. He said, I learned this by heart when I was a student, when I first came across it. He said, humans are happiest when they're engaged in some project or activity that they define as more important than themselves. But if you really believe that saving other people's souls is the Great Commission, and you're committed to doing that, that's something that you define as more important than yourself. But you don't need religion to do that. I get exactly the same thing by being an anti-racist and anti-Nazi activist. So I think there are elements that make people happy, which you can find in many contexts, including religious groups. But it's not the religion that does it. It's the fact that the group has these generic components.
So you said that humans are happiest when they're engaged in some project or activity which they define as more important than themselves.
Yeah.
So do you think that for an atheist, that's a difficult thing to achieve?
Absolutely not. See, this is one of the problems that we get with theists, and particularly with Christians. I'll say I don't believe in God, and they'll say, oh, you believe in nothing then? No, I just don't believe in God. I believe in all sorts of things, and I believe in all sorts of causes. Like, for example, in terms of more important than me, I said this on a video the other day, actually, I define my society as more important than me. Therefore, I'm quite happy to put in a great deal of time to try and improve my society by opposing racism and fascism and neo-Nazism. And at times that's put me at significant risk, particularly if you go around poking neo-Nazis with a stick, you have to expect them to react. And I actually had police sat outside my front door for 24 hours a day for quite some protracted period of time a few years ago because of death threats that were credible threats. But that hasn't stopped me because my society is more important than me. And I think I don't need to believe in God to find a purpose. And that's really what we're talking about, is a purpose. I would actually say that it's probably more of a purpose because it's one I chose. It's not one that some pastor gave me. And it didn't come out of a book written by people who didn't know where the sun went at night. So, much as I'll say, religion is not a mental disorder, that doesn't mean I'm not dismissive of its tenets, because I absolutely am. And as an atheist, I am more than capable of defining my purpose.
So you said that religion is a manifestation of the human condition, pattern seeking, agency detection, type 1 errors, and so on. So if religion is a manifestation of the human condition, do you disagree with people who say that, as we become more educated and more knowledgeable generally as a species, that religion will disappear? What you seem to be suggesting is that, no, that's not the case, because religion isn't something which is due to a poor understanding of the world. It's the manifestation of features of the human species which are not going to go away, which are inbred in us.
I'm not really saying anything of the sort. I'm not going down on either side of that equation. Because I don't have a crystal ball, and I can see how it is possible to remove religion, and many, many people do so by learning about critical thinking. I mentioned the scientific method earlier. That's all about not falling for our evolved traits. It's about rising above that. But first you need to understand the enemy, if you like. You need to understand our evolved heuristics. Then you can learn to bypass them. Now, I don't know whether or not religion will ultimately go away completely. And there is a very good argument that as societies such as British society has become significantly less religious than it was a century ago, we've just latched on to other things as a society. You mentioned football earlier, for example. The hatred that you'll get from supporter of one team versus another. In your hometown of Liverpool, you got Everton. I don't know that, but I'm told that they don't get on terribly well.
There are probably better examples, I think, yeah. The Everton-Liverpool rivalry, I think, is a bit more based around banter as opposed to hatred. But you're right. And in some ways, that's a manifestation of the human condition, isn't it? Yeah, we like to be part of a group, and we have a distrust of people who aren't part of that group. And that's evolution, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Back in the day, if a nearby tribe encroached on our patch, we would take action against them.
And of course.
And in a similar way, football supporters of rival teams have a hatred of one another in the same way that Jews and Arabs in the Holy Land have a similar thing. And I remember someone saying, for example, and it'd be interesting to hear your take on this, and this again goes back to generic human qualities which are inbred in us, said something like, we are all racists. We all have, as part of our humanity, a distrust of people who are not like us. And what we need to do is we need to rise above those evolutionary traits and realize that they are irrational in order to live in peace and harmony.
I absolutely agree with that. Yeah. I think, again, it's limiting to say we are all racists. I think there are many, many reasons why we distrust each other, and they're not all down to silly things like skin colour. But yeah, absolutely, we all have evolved to mistrust those who we define as the other. And we do need to understand that all across this planet we have much more in common than we have dividing us. And we need to get away from those evolved psychological traits that lead us to distrust and hate each other. To get back to the theme of today's discussion, I am so tired of having to explain to Christians that I don't want to hurt them, that I don't, spend my time abusing people, and I don't routinely tell lies to everybody that I meet, and I'm not a thief. Because that's their take on people who aren't them.
So what misconceptions have you had to rise above with regards to people of a Christian persuasion?
I knew you were going to ask that. And to my shame, there are quite a few that I had to really think through. The last couple of congregations that I were involved in, I would describe as particularly toxic. And they did damage me. I think I talked about this in the last time, so I won't go over it again. But I was quite damaged by the time I eventually left the church. And because of the availability heuristic that I talked about earlier, for a long time, that was my most recent direct experience of a congregation. So that heuristic led me to treat all Christians with a suspicion that really wasn't warranted. I expected Christians to be abusive, for example, because my last congregation was, in spite of the fact that I'd known many Christians prior to those last couple of churches I was a member of, who were far from abusive. But nonetheless, that was my last memory, and that stuck, and it hurt, and that's another heuristic. Things that really hurt us tend to stick. It took away the foundations of everything I thought I knew. So I had to put my life back together. I had to change my worldview. And part of the new worldview was about a nasty, cruel, abusive, callous, deceitful Christians. And it took me some time to get beyond that. So I would mistrust anyone who said they were a Christian. And for a while, I did fall into the trap of thinking, well, that's only because they're all insane. Well, they're not. But so I had to get rid of that one myself. I had to give myself a really good shake about not discriminating on religious grounds, because it's really interesting. I wouldn't discriminate against other religions. I didn't have a problem with Buddhists. I didn't particularly have a problem with Muslims because I knew I didn't know enough about Muslims. Probably that's the biggie, is that I had to go on a bit of a journey myself. And it did create some difficulties in my relationship with my sister, who, as I say, she's now retired, but at the time she was a working Anglican vicar with a congregation of her own. And whenever we talked, it got quite acrimonious. Now, I think partly that was to do with her desire to reconvert me, which was totally unrealistic. But also I think it was due to my default belief that she's a Christian, so she must be deceitful. So I think probably that's the big one for me, is just being able to put that behind me. And you can only do that by being aware of it. Knowledge is power. And only by being prepared to look at yourself and your own motivations and think, this is bloody stupid, are you able to put it behind you. But maybe that is where the potentially positive future for human society lies. It's in that ability to accept that we're all bloody fallible. And from that, I got, like the maxim I told you about earlier, who cares what I think? I might be wrong. I don't have the right to impose my view. All of those things come from that period of introspection 30 years ago.
And I'm sure you'll agree with me that rising above misconceptions, I know you'll agree with me that there are atheists who we would both find completely insufferable.
Oh yeah, many of them.
And atheists who we would find convivial and pleasant. And by that same token, there are Christians who are insufferable, and there are Christians with whom we would get along perfectly, to the extent that, I know that you would probably agree with me that you would rather spend some time with a compassionate and convivial Christian rather than, and you will know the type, the sort of angry, Besa.
I used to be one of those, yeah. I was the angry atheist, yeah. I will hold my hand up to that. Fortunately, that was a long time ago.
I think there are quite a number of people, I don't know them, but I encounter them online. And perhaps from a mental health perspective, it would be interesting to discover your perspective on that. What would your advice be to those atheists who are almost pathologically opposed to any sort of religion?
Take the time to introspect. Take the time to accept that if you don't think things through, I think it was Aristotle said the unexamined life is not worth living. If you want to get beyond that emotional knee-jerk, that angry atheist state that I was in for a year or two, reflect. Examine your life. Because I'm pathologically opposed, if you like, to any sort of religion.
Well, pathologically opposed means that it's harmful to yourself.
Well, if that's how you define it, then it doesn't include me. But I would say that I am absolutely opposed to any form of religion I've ever heard of, but I'm not opposed to the people, because I think you can make a distinction between the idea and the adherent.
Well, you know the type I'm talking about, and you can just see it. Discussing religion and religious ideas, you can see it makes them angry.
Yeah, introspection. The best cure for anger is to understand yourself and understand that you are not the religious person. You don't need them to agree with you any more than you need to agree with them. Just accept you are who you are, they're who they are, stop being such a bloody control freak, and let people get on with what they believe. As long as it does not impact upon you, or I would argue I would take it further and say your society. And I'll give you an illustration of that, because I'm a straight white man. I'm about as privileged as you get in my society, apart from the fact I'm not incredibly wealthy. But I see the damage that Christianity does to my gay neighbours, to my trans neighbours, to women, to all sorts of minority groups. I think it's important to get involved in combating that too. But as long as you're arguing against the idea and not necessarily the people, cool, go for it.
Stuart, thanks for joining me this morning.
Thank you very much for having me. I've really enjoyed it.
Thanks for joining us this morning on the Unshaw Podcast. As always, Stuart managed to bring both clinical insight and real honesty to a subject that's so easy to oversimplify. What stuck with me most was his reminder that religion itself isn't a mental illness. It's really just a reflection of our human wiring, the way we search for meaning, crave belonging, and sometimes fall into those irrational shortcuts. Those traits can lift us up or weigh us down, but they're not going anywhere anytime soon. It certainly gave me plenty to think about, and I hope it's done the same for you. So whether you're listening at home, on your travels, or like me, just settling back after time abroad and enjoying the extended long bank holiday weekend in the UK, thanks for joining me. Until next time, keep questioning, keep reflecting, and most importantly, take care of your mind.